Hello and welcome to Reaction Norm, your source for biology in culture and politics. I am joined today by Charles. Say hello, Charles.
Hello, Charles.
Unfortunately, Michael is away this week, so when the cat is away, the mice will do their best to give our faithful viewers a good episode. And so what are we talking about this week, Charles?
So I think you actually suggested this, but you wanted to get into anti-vaxxers.
I do, yes.
Yeah. So these are people who have the belief that vaccinations I guess shouldn't be done for their children at the very least, and maybe for other people too. There's a different host of beliefs against vaccinations and ideas around that these are even causing certain kind of problems.
Exactly. And why? So you'll see if you open any major publication, you're going to see a lot of things about the anti-vax movement. The WHO, this is just one example, the WHO has named its top 10 sort of concerns for 2019 is vaccine hesitancy. And so that's just the reluctance or refusal to get a vaccine yourself or to vaccinate your family. The New York Times is always running pieces about this. So this is something that is in the news, and a lot of people have been trying to explain. And their explanations aren't bad, but I thought that here at Reaction Norm, we could do our own angle. We could take our own angle. And so I think that one aspect that doesn't get talked about a lot. So, okay, let me just preface this. We're going to talk about one small aspect. I am not trying to explain the entire movement. A lot of people are coming at this from a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of good explanations, but I would like to talk about what I think one aspect of human nature and human evolution has contributed to this movement.
Okay.
Sounds good? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so that angle is, so I'd like to just preface this, like one more preface before we really get into it too. A lot of the vaccine, anti-vax stuff came out of like some bunk study in the 70s by that Andrew Wakefield guy, he was the guy who he pretty much falsified data to make it seem that vaccines was linked to autism. So anyone who was sort of legitimately duped by that, we're not going to get into that. We're kind of talking about the people now that are maybe just skeptical of like big pharma, or they think that they can't trust the medical establishment, or whatever host of reasons. People have got a lot of reasons. People who are anti-vaxxers sort of run the political gamut. They're not an easy group to necessarily pin down. They're not necessarily right. They're not necessarily left. They're often, fairly educated or not educated. So it's an interesting group of people. And so I wanted to talk about how humans learn and social learning and the adaptations we have for that, and how that maybe has contributed to people's decision to not vaccinate.
Yeah, we're going to have to unpack a lot of that.
And we're going to have to unpack a lot. And like I said, this to me is not an overarching, huge explanation. This is what I think is one interesting aspect that we can explore from our angle of,
Yeah. I mean, like the word social learning or cultural evolution, like most people aren't going to know what that means. Maybe stepping back a bit would be helpful.
Yeah.
So think, okay, you're a person and you have in front of you a subject you know nothing about, right? Like, let's say you're trying to get a surgery, right? And you're not a surgeon yourself. You don't know anything about surgeries, and you need to pick a surgeon. How do you pick it, right? It's like if you went up to surgeons and asked them questions, you don't understand surgery enough to ask anything where you could figure out the skill level of the surgeon, right? So, you might look online, like now that we have online, and look at different reviews. You might ask some people, you might notice someone that a lot of people pay attention to, or a lot of people have a positive opinion of. That's not necessarily the best way to pick a surgeon, but it's certainly better than picking at random, right? Better would be that if you knew all about surgery and you could pick them directly, right? You can think of this even kind of related to when you're hiring for the people who actually do hire, right? If you know nothing about the role that you're hiring for, it's how do you hire the person? Oh, okay, they had a fancy title and they worked at a really famous company. It's like, okay, maybe they're good, right? I mean, that's actually like a really kind of bad way to hire someone, but it's better than picking at random, right? But if you're like an expert, like let's say you're an expert engineer or scientist on a specific field and you're trying to hire someone for that role, like if it was like me, for example, I could ask that person like specific questions to try to gauge their skill. And of course, any test I give, it's going to make mistakes. It's probably make systematic mistakes, but it's much more direct. It's much better in a lot of ways than like looking at, what title they had, what companies they worked at, et cetera, et cetera. Are they famous? Are they head in anything? But people do that stuff, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you're totally tapping into what social learning sort of looks like now in our culture. Do we want to talk into a little bit about, so there is a theory, and so social learning is sometimes called cultural learning or cultural evolution. And so just to step back and sort of talk about where, we refer to it as sort of an adaptation. If we want to talk about where these adaptations come from, is that there would be an argument that once humans figured out how to like have a culture in that you can pass on things that you've learned to subsequent generations with high fidelity, that really sort of kickstarted our evolution in terms of being, like intelligence and able to like live in groups. And
yeah, so I mean, like some people have argued, and I think it's a good argument for this, is that one of the things that's very powerful among humans is our ability to pass information from generation to generation to generation. And what do you mean by generation or like information though, right? Okay, well, like it could be from your parents or it could be from a teacher or a peer. You might learn how to play a sport, right? Like maybe your father was, a really good baseball player and, he teaches his child how to play baseball. Or maybe like someone hires that person, that father, but for someone else's kid and he teaches them. Or maybe you have a friend that's really good at baseball and they teach you, but it doesn't just have to be baseball. Like I think it could be like different engineerings and sciences. You could, become a mathematician. You could learn how to like be a blacksmith. Like all this is being passed on. So like this is social learning, like social in the sense, there's many people and you're learning from other people. But the really interesting thing is that sometimes this learning, like, learning from one person to another person can happen over many, many generations. And that, people who this information may have came from originally might not even be alive. They might be long, long dead. So that's the social learning thing, right? And often many of the important things about what to learn, like how to catch a ball or how to make a sword, if you're a swordsmith or something like that, or how to build a truck or a computer, many of the important things are passed down pretty well. Like what it means by like high fidelity. Like you're making a pretty good copy, like in terms of like the way you do things, right? But every now and then, you might not copy exactly. Like things might be a bit differently. And maybe most of the time those differences don't matter, or maybe some of the time, like a lot of the times, differences are a bit harmful, right? Like they make things a bit worse. But every now and then, one of those, just changes that might be somewhat random might improve things, right?
Right. So in the same way that people evolve and how evolution works, it's almost this like a very analogous process that's happening in the way that we're accumulating knowledge. I think exactly what you've described, right?
Yeah. It's similar to genetics, but let me give an example to make this kind of more real for a lot of people. Imagine that, you're, let's see if I remember how like blacksmithing works properly, but it was very common at one point to have blacksmiths, right? Like I think in the UK, maybe just among the English, like the name Smith was very common. I think it had to do with like, someone in your family being a blacksmith at one point, I think. But anyways, not important for the story. Maybe like originally, like you were working with steel and, like people just like learned how to make different things out of steel. You can make, I don't know what people make out of steel, like cups and fences and, I don't know, like sharp pokey things you use on the stove and forks and knives and all that stuff. And then someone accidentally sprinkles a bit, like, so this gets passed on from generation to generation, just making steel, like use like basically pure steel and you build all this. And then someone accidentally like sprinkles in some carbon, right? Maybe it's carbon from like, wood or something like that, or like charcoal, and it improves it. Like it actually makes the steel stronger, right? It's better use for like a lot of use cases. and someone notices this and it gets passed down, or maybe like they don't notice and just gets passed down, and maybe like you're two different groups and you're making swords without carbon, you're making swords with carbon, and the ones with carbon just perform better, and you end up like, I don't know, slaughtering like, or at least like the males.
Right, your group's going to do better because you've got better technology now.
Right. But this can also be learned. Like if you notice a group's quite successful, it's like, well, maybe you like broadly start copying them, right? Like, there does seem to be human instincts around copying individuals that you see that seem successful to you, right?
Right, absolutely. Another like example that we could do, and this is just to take it like way further back in evolutionary history, is sort of after, when humans went from hunter-gatherer to sort of more agricultural in a lot of communities. Like, so let's take corn. If you were just to try and eat corn, you would probably not do well because you don't get enough, I believe it's like niacin in your diet, and that can lead to some sort of poisoning and you die, and it's just like really terrible. But somehow these prehistoric societies realize that if you process the corn with some sort of alkaline, the niacin is in the corn, it's just not digestible unless you process it with some sort of an alkaline agent, and then that is through some sort of chemical reaction, your body is then able to access the niacin in the corn, and you're healthy and do really well. Now, no one in these communities understood why it worked. They just knew that it did. And they might not have even known you have to do this or you'll get very sick. It was just, when you eat corn, you must do this. And this was passed on. And there's similar more examples of that. But this would be, one society who was relying on the staple crop probably would not do well at all. Whereas if you have a culture that when you prepare corn, this is how you have to do it, even if you don't have an understanding of it, that will sort of that will favor your group.
Yeah, there's like some people start doing it, but sometimes it's with various rituals or traditions or superstition. Like you might give them these different names, but people often feel they have to do it. Here's one example. I think among Muslim communities or Muslim, people who self-identify as being Muslim, I think washing is requirements for praying. And if you live in an area that's very dirty, right? It's like not very hygienic. Maybe people are pooping outside or whatever. Then if you're someone who washes your hands, for religious reasons, you would also benefit from that. Like when you want to go eat, right? You would be maybe less likely to catch a disease or whatnot. So like maybe like that might be an example of like a mechanism like this. Like you're doing something and you do it for whatever reason you feel. Like maybe there's some kind of ritualistic reason, or maybe you're building something. You just always did this activity as part of it, but you could get these other benefits that are maybe unrelated to that, and for reasons that you might not be aware of, right?
Right. So I think the adaptation then, if we were again trying to like bring it down to the biology, is that we have an adaptation that makes us good imitators of other people.
Yeah, so it does seem that we have adaptations around learning from others, right? And then you might like wonder, well, who do you learn from, right? There's tons and tons of people. Who do you pick, right? And it seems like if someone's a bit more skilled than you at something, you can tell, and you say, okay, well, I can like pay attention to this person and maybe broadly copy them, and I can learn from that. But if they're a lot better than you, like you want someone that like you're nothing, or you're an amateur and you want to find a master, like you can't tell who the master is, right? Like they're too different than you. Like you have no idea who the master is. You can't tell the difference between someone who's a master and someone who's like knows nothing or is a charlatan, right? So what it seems like humans do to solve this problem, and it's not to say it's a perfect solution, it actually has problems, but it seems what humans do is they look at who other people are paying attention to, and then they start paying attention to that person also, and then maybe also broadly copying them. And that seems to be better than picking at random, right? It's not perfect. And I'll give you one example how it's not perfect, but it's better than picking at random. So you can find someone more skilled. And I'll say, like, for example, like with the type of engineering that I have a background in, I do notice people enter the field like beginners, and I do notice that the people who they often pay attention to are usually below average in skill. And it doesn't mean that these people might not, improve over the years, but I think what happens is they can't really relate to someone who's has like a very, very like high mastery of it, because they're just too different. And whatever someone who says that has that kind of mastery, it just seems very abstract and like kind of
Right.
like vague and meta. And
I kind of want to like pump the brakes a little bit, because I think that you're talking about like when the adaptation like doesn't work well. And I think that's really important, but like maybe it'd be better to like lay out like why we have it and when it does work, because I think that like what you're talking about will come in really well when we try and tie this back to people making what I would consider a bad decision.
yeah. So I mean, like even in this situation, like even though you can't find the master, or people aren't finding like absolute masters in this, finding someone who's below average is still better than picking at random, because if you know nothing, you can learn something from someone below average, right?
Right.
So, and then once you get to that stage, it's like you can like notice someone a little higher, right? So not just a little higher, but like a lot higher. So this type of mechanism does seem to be helpful, right? Even though it makes mistakes, which we're not going to talk about right now. And of course, people are probably thinking, what does this have to do with anti-vaxxers, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm going to take it back to anti-vaxxers, but I just wanted to like sum up what you think. So it's like natural selection has favored imitators who could like, so I'm actually quoting Joseph Henrich here. So I wrote down his quote. So these are not my words, but natural selection favors imitators who could evaluate potential models, and they preferred the most successful of those models. So I guess the idea was that in a society, and even actually there's a bunch of interesting studies that even babies are really, really good at figuring out who is a good person to imitate. So they've done studies with like babies in rooms. And if you like pick up a novel item, novel to the baby, obviously not to the person, and you look at it confused, a baby will be far less likely to imitate you versus if you interact very confidently with that item. So, I mean, this is something like, this is an innate like adaptation that we have even from like a very, very young age. And like there's a long list of all the ways that we not even necessarily consciously choose who to imitate. And that's often like people that seem to be successful, people who are like the same sex as you, people that are older than you. I've got like a little list here. I could remember it all, but
I think also same ethnicity. And this is ethnicity in kind of like the scientific sense of ethnicity, not ethnicity in the sense, if you read some of the comment sections of the various blogs out there, like more of the scientific definition of ethnicity.
Right, exactly. There's like a lot of, so there's like a lot of cues that people look at, like their like health, their happiness, their skill, their relatability, their competence. Blah, blah, blah. So there's, exactly like you said. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is through cultural learning, like we have an adapted suite that makes us look at other people around us and want to copy them if they seem successful in their behaviors.
Yeah, seems is, I think, the key word, seems successful.
Exactly, that we would maybe evaluate as successful in whatever metric that is, but probably usually like sort of healthy, happy, we could agree. And that would be that. And so the problem is now that I think that one level, so to take it back to the anti-vax, my thinking is that let's call this a scientifically settled issue, right? Well, you would agree with that, right? Vaccinations. We understand the process.
So, I mean, like, okay, so I don't have a deep understanding of the anti-vaxxers arguments, right? I do suspect that there may be some claims they make that are totally valid. Do I think it's a good idea to vaccinate your kids? I actually do. But it does, I'm hesitant to like just write off every single thing they claim. Because I mean, there very well could be something, they could have some valid points.
All right. Right? This is Charles. Charles is very like detail oriented, and this is what makes him a fabulous engineer. I am much more willing to paint in really broad strokes. And I'm just going to say that like tetanus is real bad, man. You want to like take your chances with tetanus. That's on you. I think that like it is documented to be a really terrible disease. And I think that like you could very like say sort of without any, other caveats or anything, that it is good for humans to avoid contracting tetanus. And so if you have like a magic shot that seemingly has almost very, very low amount of complications, then we would say that this is a good thing for you.
Yeah. I can think of, I don't know if this is an anti-vaxxer argument, but I'll just say one I can imagine. There is a risk that you could contract the disease you're trying to be vaccinated for, right?
Oh yeah, it depends on the vaccination. It tends
polio, for example, right?
There's some, but like that's not true for all of them because they don't. Yeah. Anyways. Right. But so the point being,
that's a valid argument, though. I mean, like even though like it's very low risk, and I still personally think you're better off vaccinating your kid even for polio than not. Like it is. There do have a point to that, right?
Okay, I'm not really going to touch that because I don't want to. But the point being that like there's a well-documented, like these diseases are well documented. They are horrible in that they're like often fatal or very debilitating or leave you like disfigured or, with disabilities for the rest of your life. So we didn't just pick things that were like annoyances or like kind of, like a little, stupid disease. Like we fried some big fish, shall we say, that were things.
like I said, like
from a public health standpoint,
I have
I know you have, right?
My preference is to vaccinate, despite the risks. I still think it's a good idea to vaccinate. I mean, I'll even tell you, like I travel to the developing worlds for business from time to time, and before I go, they stab me with needles and vaccinate me for various things. I think it was like, God, what was it, like 2 weeks ago was the last time I got stabbed with a needle for some vaccination. So I mean, my preference is to vaccinate.
Right. Yeah. I'm not necessarily arguing. I'm sort of like laying out that like, this is something that I think has a lot of good science behind it, right? You can look at how bad the diseases are and it's very well documented. You can look at like, you can just read it. Even if you don't want to read like scientific articles, you can read history books. Right? Like this has been like a huge public health win and saved a lot of people's lives and the quality of their lives and blah, blah, blah. So people are still choosing not to do this. And I would say that one aspect of this is that they look at people through social media or in their community who are seemingly successful and that they're modeling that behavior. And like, it's an adaptation that is probably not serving them well in that particular situation.
So it sounds like you're saying, oh, I know what you're saying, but like, it sounds like what you're saying is that their social learning instincts are coming into play.
Yes.
And they're looking for people to like copy. And they're noticing some people who they have a high opinion of in the sense of like social learning and all that this person is against vaccinations and I'm going to copy this person, right?
Yes. And I think that science is hard and we don't have a good adapted mind for the scientific method or for making decisions in that way. And for thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human history, copying successful people worked, and it worked pretty good. But now we're in a new environment and it doesn't work well in every situation. So in that, so I'm just saying it's sort of an evolutionary mismatch.
The thing is it never works good in every situation though.
No,
right?
Certainly, right? But I'm just talking about an aspect of it.
So let me give you an example, right? So people in marketing use, this social learning stuff, cultural evolution, what do you want to call it? I guess more social learning. They use this, but they call it influencer marketing, right? So you can, for example, you'll get a famous football player, like a really successful football player. I don't watch football, so I can't name any names, but you take a famous football player and you get him to talk about car insurance and advertisement. And what it seems is like this will measurably increase sales of that car insurance, right? And you might think, well, what does the football player know about car insurance? Well, nothing, right? Like the football player doesn't know anything, but that this person is famous and successful seems like that's what people are copying. It's like, okay, I see someone who's famous, I see someone who's successful, right? And I'm going to copy them, right? So
right. And it's not necessarily like a conscious, you're like, oh, I'm going to like,
no.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like a subconscious bias.
Look how people act around, like, let's say, like famous actors or famous musicians, or maybe if you're in a kind of domain, like whoever's, maybe you're some kind of engineers or famous engineers in that space, or you make tech companies like Elon Musk, for example, right? Or what's the other guy's name? Crap, I can't remember his name right now. Whatever his name is, Elon Musk is like one of them. That's what's the 0 to 1 author's name? I can't remember his name. The other guy that was involved with PayPal. I mean, like these two
Peter
are both.
Thiel.
Yeah, Peter Thiel. Both of them are quite famous. They're quite successful, and people just broadly copy them, right? Without even like thinking about the details. Like if someone else said the exact same things that they said without giving an explanation, like just like they don't give an explanation, would they copy the person? And I think the answer is no, right? And I think there's evidence to support that that's not the case. It's that this specific person says this that seems to matter, right?
Right, totally.
And so this isn't new. It's just like you doing this, like this, like, and you're not choosing to do. It's just kind of like what you are and like how you are. You choosing to do these things that we call social learning makes mistakes, but it's better than picking at random. You're better off doing this than not, even though like it makes mistakes. And
unless you get tetanus.
Yes. So I mean, let's get back to the anti-vax stuff, right?
Right.
So you might say, well, why don't the anti-vaxxers, believe science, right? Like believe science, damn it. And I don't think most people, or really anyone, believes science. I mean, like, what does that mean to believe science, right? Like, okay, do you understand? Did you go read all the studies? Did you go try to do the experiments yourself? Did you reproduce them? Do you understand the math, right? Like, I mean, like, this is one of my complaints. Like, a lot of researchers, a lot of scientists, like, don't even understand the math, right?
Yeah.
They just
math is real hard, man.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't know if I want to say this. I was in a conversation with someone at one point. I'm not going to mention what field they're in because this will give away too much information and might make someone uncomfortable. But they were explaining to me how they're doing experiments, and like I was just thinking in my head, it's like this is wrong. Like he was jumping like, oh, this is causation. It's like, no, it's not. Right? Like it's really, really not. Right? Causation is something someone looks for in a lot of these experiments. It's a magical word. But like I had all sorts of criticism about the way he's setting up the experiment and going about it, and like a lot of like researchers, they learn something in school. They might find some like spreadsheet on the internet and use that, or they pay someone who doesn't really understand it themselves to do this stuff, but understands a little better than them. And you think from like even like the anti-vaxxer point of view, it's like they don't have the background to do this. I mean, a lot of the scientists don't really have the background for the math, but they have a better background than a lot of the anti-vaxxers. It's like, okay, so they're not really believing science, right? Because they don't have the background to understand the research. They couldn't do the research themselves, right? So it's like, it's not about believing science. It's about believing scientists, right? Which is a very, very different thing, right? And a scientist can like if someone was to just believe them, like take their authority, they can be malicious in ways, like maybe intentional, unintentional. Like they have preferences, they have their own politics. They can push that, right? And I mean, you certainly see a lot of that. I mean, there's fields in academia that seem to be just institutionalized politics, right?
Right.
I won't go into specific ones because I don't want to get in that argument right now. But
no,
I mean, you can abuse that authority that some people like give you to do that, right? So it's like you might look at it then, okay, if they're not believing science and they're believing scientists, right? How different is this than just believing like someone else they find famous? Or like you might even, like, some people compare this to religion. They make this religion versus science arguments. Like these people aren't really believing science, they're believing scientists. And if you believe a scientist, how is that different than believing your pastor, your priest, or your imam, or like whatever it is, right?
Right. And it's an interesting that you say that too, because I notice that often, like if you really want to like go into the internet and make yourself depressed, you can go on like Facebook and forums and stuff, and people get into discussions, and sometimes they'll be like, well, you just need to look at this study or evaluate this for yourself. But often the argument is, you should be listening to me because I am an expert.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's sort of like, I think, goes to show like another sort of check for like the social learning is then that we think that is an argument that this person knows more than you, so you should automatically defer to them. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I'm saying that is like the mechanism through which humans, learn. And
yeah, but then it gets back to, you're not believing science, you're believing scientists.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. You said it really well.
Yeah.
And then I was going to also say to add like another layer of how this is all getting sort of like mushed up from what, environment humans evolved in. It's like, normally you would look into your community or your band or your family, and you would see sort of evaluate day in, day out of how people are living and if they seem healthy or this or that. But now your community might be social media. And that you're not getting you're not getting the real picture of what these people's lives are like. You are getting like a picture that is probably like very like washed and marketable and nice. So that like, I've even heard like one example was, I read an expose of like, I won't use the girl's name or something, but she had a really pretty blonde girl, and she was really advocating for a very restricted diet that I think was like raw and no grains and no dairy or anything. And like, her health was actually terrible, and her like hair was falling out, and she was like having all these health problems. Till finally her doctor was like, you need to like eat more food because this is terrible for you. But if you just were following her Instagram, like, you would think that she was just the picture of health.
So it sounds like what you're saying, like from the point of view of like these instincts around social learning, of learning from others, that if you just look at like Instagram or some of the other social media platforms, you're not
TV really, or anything. Yeah.
You're not really able to judge whether this person's successful or not. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm saying that you're not getting full information like you may have once if you were actually living in a community with everybody day in, day out.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
So it's sort of like a double whammy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we want to talk a little bit about, because it just is another, you've touched on this, and I would like to talk about it a little bit more, of human social learning and sort of prestige. Because I mean, success can mean one thing, and I don't want to make it seem like, oh, we're just always copying necessarily like rich people or this or that, because success can mean a lot of different things. Like, you can be successful in a lot of different ways in our society, or you could be like evolutionary successful. It means that you're just like banging out kids all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that like actually like success, like it comes with too many connotations, and we should talk about prestige as a concept, because really social learning is about identifying people that we view as sort of like prestigious in our community.
Yeah, I mean, like the problem with the word prestige, I think, is it's too abstract for a lot of people if you don't give examples, right?
Right.
And I mean, it is an abstract concept. I think success is useful, but you're right that people might lock that into certain kinds of success, right? But for example, like if you're a good guitarist, right? Like you might be poor in terms of wealth, but if you're a good guitarist, that might attract other people. If you're a good like dancer or something like that, certain kinds of dances. If you're a good painter, if there's lots of other things you become good at that the opposite sex, especially like from females being attracted to males, like that could make you attractive to the opposite sex, right? It's not just becoming successful in wealth. Wealth, actually, it's not really wealth. I think it's the ability to get resources, right? So it's not just like having money; it's ability to get more money. I think I read something once. I don't know how like large the study was or if it was replicated, but there was something I remember reading where women seem more attracted to entrepreneurs than people who just like had lots of money, which is kind of interesting. Like I personally didn't expect that. I guess you being a woman, what do you think, Trish?
Well, I would say yes. Like obviously, who you're choosing for a mate or who you're attracted to is like a very there's a lot, like it can never just be boiled down to one thing, right? And I think that like what the Prestige would talk about is it seems like, you know, guys in bands who are like not making any money always seem to have a lot of women around, and that's strategies working for them. So like you said, they might be good at guitar and that'll be working. But yeah, I think that Prestige is yeah, it's status by sort of like achievement and influence in a social group rather than like authority or power or something.
Yeah, so humans, you said the word social status, so I'll get into that a bit. Hopefully it's not too technical for the people watching. Social, there seems to be at least, I'll say at least rather than just two, but at least two kinds of social status in humans. One is dominant social status. The other one's prestige social status. So dominance is like, you know, I'll punch you, I'll kick you, I'll stab you, I'll fire you.
And that's right? Sort of like how chimps are organized, right? Like chimps, all the power is like dominant strategies.
Well, like even humans. I mean, if you work in a company, someone could fire you, right? Like, I mean, the way the police treat you, that's dominance too, right?
Right. Yes.
So I mean, like human societies have that aspect of dominance, right? And so that's one kind, right? The other kind is prestige social status, right? So that's people. It seems like people paying attention to you because other people are paying attention to you, right? And it might initially have been attracted to you because you have some kind of skill, right? I guess you could think of the difference between a boss to company versus a leader at the company. I know, like, you know, like managers just like love to call themselves like leaders, which I think is just like fucking ridiculous. I swear, sorry. I both do all the technical things that I, you know, have a background in. Plus I do management. So like I'm someone who's also a manager, right? And I think managers like to call themselves leaders to make themselves feel better, right? Leaders are voluntarily followed, right? Managers
and volunteer. Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah, like the person's just choosing, you know, of their own like will to follow the person. There's no like coercion, right? Where a manager, for example, like dominant social status, there's something there. Like even when they ask you to do something, there's always like, you know, this threat, like I'll fire you, do it or else you're fired, right? You want to get paid, like they have something over you, right? And you can think of like that's kind of difference. Like your boss, you know, a manager who can fire you in a company, that's dominant social status. And it could also be like the police officer. It could also be like the if you're not that very muscular and like never trained how to fight, like the big scary guy walking down the street that might, you know, kick your ass or whatever, right? Like that's dominant social status.
And that's sort of most of the animal kingdom besides humans. That's if they're like social, it's usually kind of a dominant thing. It's like the biggest, baddest.
Yeah, I don't know if that's completely true. I haven't studied prestige that much outside of humans, so I'm not sure. I know there's a parallel with ants and the way they live down farm.
So I'm talking about like humans, like recent like ancestors, right? Like, so if we're going to talk about like other primates.
I've seen a bit with other animals, so I think there might be something like prestige in some other animals, but I don't know enough to really say much about it. But let me get into prestige.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
So prestige is where, you know, people just like they just like flood to this person, like for various reasons, and not necessarily everyone. There's like sometimes context to this. There's kind of like communities, but things like Elon Musk, right? Like people, just tons of people follow him on Twitter. Tons of people like pay attention to him. Like Barack Obama, same thing. I mean, there's different actors and actresses.
But they would also have like a fair amount of dominance too. So like if we were going to think of someone who was just like pure prestige.
Musician.
Yeah.
Or an actor, actress.
Yeah. Artists, probably.
Yeah. Or
because like Obama would be a bad example because he actually was the president. So there's like a little column A, little column B.
Yeah,
obviously very prestigious. But.
Yeah, I mean, like one thing I think I've noticed is that dominant social status sometimes gives you prestige social status, right? Like for example, like if you're in the military, right? You're a general, like you have dominance, but then it gives you a kind of prestige. Even like Barack Obama, for example, and like President Trump, for example, among like certain people, right? And that's the same with Barack Obama too, with certain people. They have dominance, but it can lead to prestige, right? And if you think of it like when someone's conquering, like say you have like invaders, like let's say the Vikings invading the UK, right? There might have been a lot of negative feelings towards them, but like once they conquered, though, like it seems very common. It seems not uncommon that women of like the kind of like local population, they kind of like flood to the conquerors eventually, like after they've conquered, right? It seems to be a very common thing. I think there's recent examples with like women in Japan like hooking up with the US soldiers that are stationed there, right? And it's not every woman, obviously. But,
there's a few things going on there too, right?
Yeah, think of even like you get sometimes like these special bloodlines of the conquerors that people find attractive, like the Khans in different places. It's just like before they conquered, they were bad, but after they've won, it's like, oh, this is now like attractive.
Yeah, I would kind of argue that like getting into sort of like sexual selection is a little bit different than like we're kind of more in the social learning, figuring out like who you imitate and how you model your behavior after, and sort of what strategies you would adopt for your life. And I feel like choosing a mate is like, there is some overlap, but I kind of feel like there's a lot of other like evolutionary stuff going on too that kind of.
Yeah. Well, so I was trying to give examples of dominant social status.
Okay, right. Yeah.
Social status, right? Just to kind of like bring that out. And then like the conversation we were having was around prestige social status and like why, because it relates to social learning. Like who do you pay attention to? Who do you copy? Right. And the word you give that kind of signal that attracts someone to like pay attention to them is prestige. Right. And I mean, it's just like this abstract word. What does it mean? Well, okay, you have to figure out like who a master is, like someone who knows a lot of this topic. Well, how do you figure that out, right? Well, you look at who other people are paying attention to and you pay attention to them also, right? And you can think of like, you can give that a word like prestige, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just like, who's everyone else paying attention to? Okay, I'll pay attention to them also, right? I mean, it's a little, I'd say there's more than that, but I think that's a good way to start thinking about it, right? Like, everyone's paying attention to Elon Musk, or everyone's paying attention to Kim Kardashian, or everyone's paying attention to Barack Obama, or everyone's paying attention to President Trump, or like whatever. And then other people start paying attention to, or like maybe not. I mean, like it depends if you consider that person to be high up on a status hierarchy. I mean, if you're not in a domain, like if you're not an entrepreneur, you might not care what Elon Musk does. Or if you're on a opposing political faction, you might not care what this particular person in politics does, for example.
Right, exactly. And depending on like your situation in life and what sort of things you're trying to learn, or what sort of skills you're trying to acquire, or what maybe you're having problems with, like you might reach out to somebody who was like your church, prestigious within your church community, or prestigious within your, I don't know, gym community, if you're trying to make gym games or something. I don't know. Yeah. I wanted to, in case sort of just preemptively, I know that some people are going to be like, Trish, this sounds really stupid. I don't like make a big decision like vaccinating or not based on what some person on Instagram says, especially when it could be something that really negatively affects your health. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about how social learning, it's so strong that you seem to get social learning, copycat behavior, and even ways that are completely maladaptive. And one of the examples I wanted to use was like copycat suicides.
Yeah, I mean, you were, I don't think you mentioned the title, but you were talking about the book, I think, The Secret of Our Success, which, by the way, I think is a horribly named book. It sounds like a self-help book, but it's an actual science book.
It's a good book. We read it in one of our reading groups a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it was great. I'd say ignore all the group selection stuff, but I mean, like other than that, like it was a fantastic book. But one of the examples that you're getting into is that there are things that can be copied that are actually not helpful, right? It's like, someone committing a suicide, then other people copying that, right? There was some other examples that I remember seeing on Twitter that I think I retweeted. I don't remember what they are right now. I wish I remembered them.
Yeah, but I mean, like copycat suicides, like this isn't a new phenomenon. This has happened, before the internet and social media. There was in the book, Henrik gives a couple examples of, I think, like communities in like Micronesia, where they had like a lot of like copycat suicide problems. It was quite sad, but that just goes to show that it's not necessarily a completely conscious process, but that this is like something that's really deeply ingrained in our psychology to sort of imitate and learn and look at what other humans around us are doing.
Yeah, I mean, there was some evidence that could be interpreted as it being very difficult for humans not to copy. Like that seems to be kind of like our tendency and our kind of default to do that, like in a lot of situations, and that we actually have to resist, like actually do stuff to prevent ourselves from copying certain individuals, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah. So I don't know if that was a little bit of a tenuous connection, but I think that when you talk about behaviors that seem to be maladaptive, or at least not necessarily good, I would say choosing, unless, okay, so things are compromised. I'm just painting with a really broad stroke for the average healthy individual who doesn't have like a complicated health thing. I would say that it is foolish not to get vaccinations. And so just as one small little piece of maybe what's going on in the psychology with people and this being a movement, I wanted to add like this little, tidbit to our to the discussion, which I don't think I haven't seen it anywhere else. So I thought that could be interesting. Do you have anything else you want to add about it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pro-vaccination. I don't think. I mean, like if people are trying to frame it as anti-vaxxers versus science, I don't think that's actually what's being framed. I think it's. I think when you're not a specialist in something, and even when you are, like it's really, really difficult to figure out what's factually accurate in the world and then make decisions based on that. And I don't think I don't think like from their point of view, like it's totally unwarranted. It's like, okay, if you don't have a very deep understanding of vaccines, right? I could see how you could like go along, like make those kind of decisions, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's behavior that seems like it's on the surface difficult to understand. I think when you really get into the psychology of it, it's quite easy to understand because, like you said,
yeah, but
you said it very well. It's like you've got like a lot. You said it with a lot more like nuance than I do because I like to be a little bit more provocative.
Yeah, but you see that kind of behavior all over the place, right? It's not just with whether like vaccines are good or not, right? I mean, like try to figure out like if you're not a surgeon, like who to pick for the surgery. I mean, like you don't know, right? And you don't know what you don't know, and it's like a really hard decision to make. So you do certain things, and some of it doesn't seem that different than what many of the anti-vaxxers do. It's just they're in a situation because they're not going to like run all these experiments, and it's not practical for them to do it. And they're trying to make the best decision they can, and they use the same tools that like everyone else is using, right? It's just they came to this conclusion. And I mean, like some of this with like social learning, cultural evolution, like the way something wins is, well, do the individuals who have this kind of like behavior, like this tradition, and that they pass it down to their kids, which one survives, or like which one has more descendants, right? And like in a sense, you win that way, right?
Right.
And like if it is actually the case, and I actually suspect it is, that for example, like not vaccinating your kids makes your kids less likely to survive, right? Well, I mean, it fits into that dynamic, right? It's pretty brutal, but I mean, like think of like religious groups that choose not to have children. Well, that tradition just disappears, right?
It's true. Kind of sorts itself out.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Great. Well, thanks, Charles, for for indulging me in my little rant this week. I'm, carrying the torch for Michael and grinding my axe about things that bother me. And so you really added a lot of good points to that, and I appreciate it.
Cool. Nice talking to you again.
Yeah, nice talking to you too.
Sure.
See you later.
See you.